About a year and a half ago in this shop, before I had the CNC, I manually machined 3 tubing benders that are very similar, and they're made to bend stay diameter tubing, 5/8, 3/4, 7/8 tubing, so that I can make seat stays and chain stays. Let me show you all the details of my benders. So I made this slick storage solution for these because I don't have a lot of space in here, and I mentioned this in my utilizing wall space effectively video, but basically the benders live up here. I pick them up off of the wall, and then I carry them over to my machine. So this one is for 3/4 inch tubing. And I just have this bracket that lives on the machine. And now without any tools, it mounts up to my machine. I gotta grab the lever arm. And this slides in and it threads on. And there's one more piece. The last piece of the puzzle is the follow bar. This is for 3/4 tubing. And so, when you want to use it, you loosen up the clamp knob, you load the tube in from below, you got to place it in the right spot to start the bend in the right portion of the tubing. You clamp, you clamp it in, and then this follow bar gets loaded from above. Nice tight fit. And then if I want to bend it, all I got to do is I just lift on this lever. So this is similar in some ways to the tube bender that I'm making and selling now. And I learned from making these benders, I brought some ideas from these into what became the finished design of the one that I make and sell now. These aren't something that I see myself really using much in the future, and they really deserve some refinement that I never got around to, that I'll probably never get around to at this point. But it was kind of cool because I learned a fair amount from them, and I got to, I took ideas that I had seen in other benders that people made and sold and stuff, and then I tried to bring in some other features. I didn't just want to copy something that was out there. I wanted to, bring something new into the world that was valuable for my own needs. So for me, I got such a small spot. This shop is pretty small. I wanted to have something that really worked well here, and so I came up with this little cleat thing, and so I can mount it onto this. You need a heavy anchor point to use a bender like this, a manual bender, because if you just lift on the lever and it's just sitting on the table, you're just going to tip it over, right? It needs to be mounted to something heavy. This machine weighs 2,000 pounds, so when I pick up and lift on the end of this lever, it's not going anywhere. And because I'm only bending stays, this is 3/4 tubing, unless it was like solid rod or something, I would be able to bend it pretty easily just by hand. So a manual bender works all right in this instance. And what this does is it solves the problem for me of they take up a lot of space. If you look at a diacro bender, which is a great bender for this sort of thing, they sit generally in your shop, sort of as an island, and you have all different bending dies and stuff, and you load them in there and you clamp it in there, and it does great bends, but then you have this arm and you kind of walk around in a circle as you're bending. You gotta swing the arm around. This one here, you're lifting the bending arm up, but with the diacro, it really eats a lot of floor space because it needs to be anchored to a heavy point, and you wouldn't put it away when you're done. You couldn't have it on a rolling cart, really. I mean, you could bolt it down to the floor and then unbolt it and skid it off to the side when you weren't using it, but they really eat a lot of floor space. Not to mention diacros are pretty expensive, and it's hard to find the tube bending dies that you need. So I wanted to make my own, and I wanted it to solve that issue for me. If I was going to go through the trouble of making one, I wanted it to actually not eat a bunch of floor space. And so I was able to do that. When you make a tube bender like this, you really want to have you want to have a solid clamping foot. So if you look at this, I load the tube from below, and the bending die here has this half round profile that I made with a ball end mill on my milling machine. I had to use a rotary table, and I tried my hardest to make it come out really smooth. It looks pretty good, but there was a lot of time that went into this. I bought a rotary table which allows you to spin pieces on the milling machine and make arcs. Because on a machine like this, if you wanted to cut a straight line, you would just crank one handle at a time and it moves in a straight line. If you wanted to cut a radius, there's a couple tricks for that, but generally you need a rotary table which sits on here, you clamp your workpiece to it, and then when you turn a crank, it spins your workpiece around and it lets you cut a radius. And so anyway, I bought a rotary table just for this, cost me like $350 for a used one, and you know, it's still a ton of work. I have hours into each one of these. I made 3 of them that are similar. And it's just so much time went into these. But anyway, so the idea with the design here is that you have this half round profile that's very smooth and it fits your tubing tight. And when you load the tube in on this clamp foot here, you also have that half round shape and you're able to tighten it down real tight. And that way, as you're doing the bend, what you're doing is this roller here rolls against the follow bar that goes on the back side. And what it wants to do is the tube doesn't want to bend. The tube wants to stay straight, right? It's strong, it's structural. And so what happens is when you're trying to bend it, it will bend in this style bender, but it's trying to just slide. It would rather just draw the tube around than bend. And so while it's bending, it's trying to slip right here. It's trying to lift the tube up. And that's why you need a lot of clamping force to keep it from sliding into the bend. Because if it's sliding, then let's say you put a stop in here, or you had a mark or something, or you're bending against the indicator, you could bend the same amount every time, but if the tube is slipping into it, you don't really have any repeatability. And so it's hard to make a matched pair of bends, right? And so, by having a clamping foot like this, it has that, it's about 2 inches tall, and what it does is it distributes that clamping force over a large surface area, and it's exactly the shape of the tubing. It's a half round of that shape, so you can put tons of clamping pressure on there and you're not going to mark up the tubing. And so like Diacros and a lot of good tubing benders, you know, most all the good tubing benders are going to have a similar sort of clamping foot that distributes the load over a larger area, but you'll see some tube benders don't really have a particularly strong clamp foot, or they don't distribute the load very nicely, because if you were just bending pipe or something and it didn't need to be super duper pretty, then you wouldn't worry about it too much. It's when you get into the thin wall bike tubing that you want to put a high gloss paint job over and you want it to be scrutinized and look good in a trade show or for your ride or whatever. Then you really want it to look nice, and you need this sort of clamp foot, and you need this tight-fitting die. You need it to be very smooth. You know, you need all these things so that the end result is a very smooth bend. Yeah, and then I mean, some other things that I thought about when I made this was, you know, this whole this lever threads in, and you don't need a wrench for that. You don't need a wrench to use any of this stuff. So, you know, I got wrenches in the shop, but I was thinking I didn't want to have to get a wrench out to use stuff. And that was something that I tried to incorporate into my newer bender that I'm making and selling. And for the most part, you don't need a wrench to use it, but you do need a 3/4 inch wrench on this part of my new bender, the clamp foot. And then to drive the lead screw, you need a 3/4 hex on the end of like a cordless drill or something. And originally, I had a knob sort of like this that I was machining. It's beautiful. And originally, I had that sort of knob for my own bender, and I found that actually it doesn't work the best. You really want to get it pretty tight, and so a knob is cool, but actually having like a hex that you can push on with a wrench is actually, I think, functionally better. And so, you know, form follows function, and I changed that in my design. So through the process of designing this, I came up with some better ideas about how I wanted to do certain parts of this so that it would work better. You know, so first of all, this doesn't have any phasing arms or anything. So let's say you wanted to do an S bend like this. You would start by doing one of the bends, and then you'd flip it around, put it back in the bender, and you'd do an opposing bend, right? So they call it an S bend because it kind of looks like an S. If you were to exaggerate the bends, it looks like that letter S. And so anyway, if you're doing those, you know, here you can see the bends. You rotate the tube 90 degrees, and now they should lie in the same plane. It should look like a straight tube at a glance, right? You don't want to see one of the bends in this plane and then another one rotated 5 or 20 or however many degrees, unless that's intentional. Generally, you want them to lie in the same plane. So how do you do that? And one of the ways that people do that on tube benders is, you know, you do your first bend. Let's say you already did this bend, and now you want to clamp it and you want to do this second bend. You know, you would load it from below. Okay, so you want to clamp it in there, And you can see that as you spin it, this kind of sweeps around out here. And so if you have an arm that sticks off down here and it has a little V block, and if that V is always on the center line of this, your die, then you can kind of sweep the tube around until it hits the crotch of that V, and then you know, you tighten it up and you know you're in the right spot and you start your bend. And that's how you would phase them. So I didn't include a provision for that on this bender, and there's not really a great spot to put it on there. That was sort of I figured I'd figure that out later, and then I just never got that far with this tool. So I'm a fan of the single bend rear end, which is something that I said in the overviews of my two most recent bike builds, and so, you know, I wasn't thinking that much, like, man, I don't really need to have S-bends anyway. I'll cross that bridge later. But certainly with my own bender that I'm making for sale now, there is that provision so you can do S-bends or, you know, multiple bends in the same tube and get them phased. Another thing that I learned from this process was, you know, I wanted to have some sort of way to get repeatability. So if you put in a tube and you bend it and you stop, you know, you unload it, and then you want to do another one to the same spot, you really would like to have some way to get repeatability. And so what I did on the ones that I make and sell is I engraved angular scales so that you can bend up to a certain line and then stop and come back. And on my bender, that works pretty well because it's driven by a lead screw. So while it's bending, you're standing right here and you can see the tick marks as they reference this part of your bending arm. And then you're driving it on a lead screw, so you're cruising along at a good clip, and then when you get close to your mark, you slow down and you just get it exactly to that mark, and then you back off the bend. Another idea that I had was, you know, what I see some benders have like holes for a cross pin so that you just push until you hit the pin, and that would work, but I never figured out exactly how I wanted to do an array of holes, and you know, you'd have to think critically about where you would put the holes so that you know, you had the right kind of increments that you wanted, and so I didn't do that. And then another thought that I had was, you know, you could just have a dial indicator like this guy here where, you know, you push on the stylus. And these don't cost that much money. This is a cheapo one. It's not incredibly accurate, and I think this was on sale for like $12. You know, so you can get a dial indicator for not a whole lot of money, and you can have it. You could build some sort of base so that the stylus would push against here, and so you would do your first bend, and you know, you would read whatever it was. You'd take the tube out, and then you would, you know, you'd measure it, and you know, if you're building a lot of the same kind of bikes, you'd get to have a pretty good idea. And these were a good vehicle for me to like spend a lot of time thinking about tube bending and trying some stuff out and practicing it. Just, you know, getting familiar with the process so that you know, every time you iterate on a design and you have a little bit more experience, you can bring some of that experience with you, and things just get better. I spent a lot of time on these, and I didn't end up using them a whole lot after I made them, before I made this other bender, but it really helped inform what I ended up doing with the other benders, and so in that way they were really valuable to me. You know, this style of bender, if you hold the tube like that, if you have a follow bar on the outside, if the die is smooth in the correct geometry, and you have a roller on the backside, you're going to get nice bends. So that's the same on a diacro. The diacro is a top loader. It's a different design in the way that you use it, but in the way that it supports the tube, it's basically the same. And there's all different styles of tube benders, but this style with no internal support and with a follow bar and a roller and a clamp lock, whatever, it works pretty well for bicycle tubing. And so, you know, this overview, hopefully it's useful to y'all if you don't have a whole lot of experience with tube bending, and hit that subscribe button. We'll have more videos about tube bending and all the stuff related to bike frame building. Catch you on the next one. Go home and go.